Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 7, Halacha 2. This is a very logical, straightforward set of halachot. Today we're going to be getting into the penalties of what happens when you are violating the Kilayim laws. The Mishnah starts off and it says that if someone layered the branches of 3 grapevines, and they created three additional vine row. In other words, in the beginning you had 3 vines, and then you layered it to create 3 new vines. So now you have a small vineyard that will be 6 vines. The Mishnah says that if their trunks, in other words, the trunk of the new ones and the trunk of the original ones are visible, in other words, above the ground for the new ones, then Rabbi Lazar, son of Rabbi Tzadok, says that if there are from 4 amos up until 8 amos between the parent vines and the offshoots, they combine to form a vineyard, but if not, they do not combine. This, by the way, is what we covered before. According to the Mara Fulda, you're effectively using these to create a new vineyard from when you had individual vines. And as we learned before, that if you have it where the vines are going to be 4 amos from one another, it's going to be a vineyard. And they can be from 4 amos up until 8 amos away to make a vineyard. But if it's going to be less than 4 amos, those are not going to count as a vineyard. It's going to count as vines that are going to be used for firewood. So the Mishnah is teaching that these new vines are going to be independent of the old vines, and they're going to combine to form a vineyard. And that if the new row is not properly spaced, then there's no vineyard that happens. That's what this is trying to teach. And the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say, but if they do not combine. So the Rambam has a slightly different reading about this, and you can see this in Mishnah Torah in Kilayim 6:9, and he's basically saying that the parent vines in question are not isolated but part of an existing vineyard, and if your layering is going to bury the parent vines themselves at the source with the offshoots emerging some distance away, then what's going to happen is you're effectively moving the vineyard. In other words, you have to look at where the original trunks. It's not where the original trunks are alone. It also is where it's coming out of the ground. And if they're going to just jut out a bit and they're going to be visible above the ground, then the status is going to stay as a part of the vineyard. And according to the Rambam's reading, that it's not necessarily like what the Maraful is explaining or the Rosh or the Rosh is explaining, where you're trying to propagate a new vineyard. The Rambam's take on it is, and by the way, really no contradiction, but that you've taken the vine, you put it down into the ground, and now it is creating a new thing over there. And the question is, that new thing over there, is that part of the existing vineyard or not? Again, the Rambam has a different take on it. Now, the Mishnah is going to get into the different prohibitions of Kalei Karam and in different situations. So the Mishnah says that a grapevine that has dried out and maybe it died, that it is prohibited to have foreign seed planted in the vicinity. Now, definitely Doraita, there's no prohibition on planting in the work area of a dead vine. But this is a Derabanan thing. The rabbis are forbidding somebody to do it, and the Gemara is going to get into the explanation why. But it's really going to be like a Maris Ein issue. And the idea is that, like we see before, if it's going to be a Derabanan thing, that says the Mishnah, does not render forbidden the product of the seed that was originally and illegally planted there. In other words, when you're making a violation that's a Doraita violation, then the seeds that you planted as well as the vine have to be uprooted and burned, and you also get makot, and if you did it on purpose, and that's going to be a violation. But if it already died, you're not allowed to do it. But if you did it, do you have to uproot the vine and burn it, and also uproot and nullify the seeds? No, but you're not allowed to do it. This one is going to be interesting. Rabbi Meir in this Mishnah says, so too, the cotton plant is prohibited to have foreign seed planted nearby, but does not render the produce forbidden. Again, what you're seeing is that this is going to be a D'Rabbanan thing. And ultimately, in the Gemara, the halacha is going to go by Rabbi Meir because it's just Rabbi Meir's opinion alone. There's no dissent to it. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, says in his name, Rabbi Meir's name, so too planting above a grapevine is prohibited but does not render the produce forbidden. So that's going to be interesting because that's also going to be where, and the meaning of this is going to get talked about in the Gemara, but basically this is going to apply to what happens if you have a single vine and you have the side of a hill, like what we were covering before in the end of chapter 6, and it's going to be on an incline. And before we were learning about groups of grapevines or an Aerys. Is that going to be where you have, like, say, the slope of a hill being 10 tefachim? Is that going to create a new makom? Now this is talking about an individual vine. And again, the point about Rabbi Meir is going to be, what's the deal with the cotton plant? Cotton plant is going to look like the grapevine that is going to be like in the winter where, and by the way, yes, we're really talking about a grapevine, a cotton plant. So the term the Mishnah uses, semer geffen, and it has a strong resemblance to the grapevine, says the Rosh. And Rabbi Meir is basically putting a fence on here for rabbinic worry that you could have the appearance of wrongdoing, a Maris Ein problem, and that's why this kind of planting does not render the produce forbidden after the fact. Now, the Mishnah continues and says the following 4 areas are prohibited with respect to the planting of foreign seed, but do not render forbidden the produce of illegal planting. Now again, these are going to be things that have rabbinic stringencies, are not d'oraita. So here they are. The first is the excess of the destroyed area in the middle of the grapevine, and this we covered with the vineyard clearing. And we covered this before in chapter 4, halacha 1, where you have the clearing of the middle of a vineyard, maybe it was burnt out, and that you can't plant it with foreign seed if the clearing measures are going to be less than 16 amos across. And this mission is teaching that illegal planting in this clearing does not necessarily result in the produce becoming forbidden, only when you're planting within the halachic d'oraita space of 4 amos are the vines and what you're planting going to be forbidden. That's going to be this 4 amma work area, that's a d'oraita obligation, but in the burnt out area where there's a 16 amos across area, you're not supposed to plant there. But if you did, do you have to uproot it? No. Is it forbidden? Do you have to burn down the vines? No. But you shouldn't do it. But if you planted within the 4 amma work area, do you have a problem d'oraita? Yes. You made that all forbidden, you have to burn it. But again, this is showing the Maris Ein rabbinic nature of what chapter 4 halacha 1 is, and that again they're worried that it's going to look like it's surrounded, that whatever you're planting there, and it's going to be enclosed in on multiple sides. That's an issue that Yerushalmi worries about a lot. And also it's going to look like maybe that you've planted it this way in the beginning without the proper setbacks, and they're going to make increased distancing, but those increased distancing areas are going to be d'Rabbanan. The second one is going to be the excess perimeter of the vineyard, and we also covered this in the Mishnah 4:1, that you can't plant foreign seed inside the perimeter, the vineyard perimeter. That's going to be where you have a surrounding wall, and then you have the edge of the vines themselves, and if that space is less than 12 amos wide, you can't plant in there. In other words, you always have to have a setback from the space between where the vineyard ends and the wall. It has to at least be 12 amos wide. We covered that in 4:1. But again, if you did it, do you have to uproot everything? Do you have to burn everything? No. Only within the 4 amos areas there's going to be a d'oraita problem. So that's the second case. The third case is going to be the excess of disruptions of the middle of the Aerys. In other words, we covered that in 6:1. That's going to be the Trellised vineyard, and it has to be 5 vines or more. And basically what this is saying is that when you have the clearing, just like 4:1 where maybe something died or was destroyed, that you can't plant it unless it measures at least 16 amos wide. And if you had, let's say, 11 vines and the one in the middle got destroyed, then there has to at least be 8 amos plus a tefach in order to have planting there. And again, that's an unusual part of the oral law. But again, if you did it, do you have a deraita violation? No, it's only in the 4 amos. But if you did it, do you have to uproot everything? No. Then the fourth case is going to be the area beneath the excess lattice of a trellised roof supporting a vineyard. In other words, we know that the vines are going to overtake a lattice over time. And let's say you planted now, not under the vine, that's always going to be forbidden, but under the empty part of the lattice, do you have to uproot it? The answer is no, but you're not allowed to do it. Why? That's a d'Rabbanan thing. Now, it does say what the halacha is. It says, however, and this is going to be d'oraita, that the area beneath the grapevine and also the work area of a single grapevine have to have at least a 4 amma work area of a vineyard, and all of these are going to render the produce of the planting to be illegal. So, you can't plant foreign seed under a grapevine, even, by the way, if that's going to be under a trellis. And the idea about the other part is that, if you have something that's extending 6 tefachim, what about the work area there? So again, the work area there is going to be 6 tefachim. Rabbi Akiva says it's 3 tefachim, so you can't plant within that 6 tefachim space. And the 4 amma work area of the vineyard, we know that also is going to be mentioned in the Mishnah over in chapter 4, halacha 3. The setbacks that you have, these are d'oraita for a vineyard, are going to be 4 amos. Individual vines are going to be 6 tefachim. So that's going to be interesting. And the Maraful explains it that planting foreign seed directly beneath a grapevine or within the work area of either a single grapevine or of the vineyard is not only prohibited, but also results in the produce of that planting being rendered forbidden. And that, by the way, is going to be a d'oraita violation. The Gemara now gets into the dried out grapevine the Mishnah talks about and planting within the vicinity. And Rabbi Lazar says that this opinion is also reflective of the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And having established that the prohibition on planting near a dried out grapevine is going to be a Maris Ein issue and enacted as a d'Rabbanan fence, the Gemara is going to answer the question. It's going to say, this is understandable in the winter. Why in the winter? Well, the Pnei Moshe says because grapevines are going to have, empty, leaves. The leaves are going to fall off. They're going to have it where they're just branches. And a dried grapevine can be mistaken for a viable grapevine. And the Gemara says, but in the summer, when dried grapevines are clearly distinguishable from a viable one, why? Because that one's dead and has no leaves, and this one is live with grapes and leaves. Well, what about in that case? Are you going to have an issue over there? And so, the Mishnah's ruling regarding the dried out grapevine is going to be representing the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbis, however, says the Rosh Cirilio, argue with Rabbi Meir on this point, and they're going to permit planting next to the cotton plant, just like they're going to permit planting next to the dried grapevine, although not everybody agrees on the cotton plant. So the Gemara is going to answer that, in fact, there are places where viable grapevines do shed their leaves even in the summer, and the idea is that you could have a case where in the summertime there's a possibility that a dried out grapevine will be confused for a viable one, so that the planting of a foreign seed in that vicinity would also give a Maris Ein issue. So that's why they're making the prohibition applicable in all seasons. And the Gemara now is going to look at the next part. So what's interesting is that this Gemara does not have a counter to Rabbi Meir. It just says the opinion of Rabbi Meir and explains it. So because it doesn't say the sages say or something like that. So when you look at the halacha lemaisa, are you going to be able to plant next to the cotton plant, the dried out cotton plant? No, because you're going to confuse it. It's going to be a d'Rabbanan fence. The Gemara addresses the clause of the Mishnah that goes to the next point, that Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Sadak, said in his name that also the planting above a grapevine is going to be prohibited. but does not render the produce forbidden. And the Gemara is going to explain what this means. Rabbi Shmuel says in the name of Rabbi Zera that the Mishnah is referring to the prohibition stated in the very beginning of this chapter. And it says that if you have foreign seed directly above a layered grapevine branch that has less than 3 tefachim of earth on it. So in other words, we're going back to chapter 7 halacha 1, where you've layered the branch and now you have between the old trunk and the new trunk, and you're trying to plant while this branch is underground. And this is basically saying, what if you've planted within, it's not layered at least 3 tefachim under the ground, and you're now trying to plant within it. So that's going to be where, this Mishnah, if you're reading it that way, would be prohibiting that you're not allowed to do it. Now, Rabbi Zera says the Rosh is holding that the produce is permitted in this case because the planting of the foreign seed on top of the layered vine is forbidden, not as a violation of Kilayim, but just on a problem of grafting. There's going to be a grafting problem. So the idea is that illegal grafting, even if it's going to involve Kilayim, does not render the produce forbidden. So that's an interesting nuance, right? So if I'm doing Kilayim, I have to burn everything. That's the thing. But if I do grafting, do I have to burn everything? No. So there's another interpretation. Rabbi Bun Barhia is going to give another interpretation. It says in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, where it says that this Mishnah is referring to the introduction of foreign plants within a 10 tefach airspace of a grapevine. Again, what would that be? That would be like on an incline. And in other words, you have this embankment, and the question is, what about if you're planting foreign plants within the 10 tefach airspace of where your grapevine is? Alternately, and this is what we're going to get into on the next part of the halacha, with a single grapevine, Rabbi Yossi says that we originally thought that while a vineyard has the prohibited airspace, which we did cover before, what is this teaching that's going to be new? And the Gemara says from that which Rabbi Bun Barhia is saying in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, that the Mishnah is referring to the introduction of foreign plants within the 10 tefach airspace of a grapevine. This is telling us that the grapevine is going to be a single grapevine that's going to have prohibited airspace. In other words, what is this Mishnah teaching that's going to be new, right? Before, when we were looking at it, it was teaching on the incline that it's going to be for a vineyard. And what this is trying to say, says the Amorah, Rabbi Yossi, is that this Mishnah says grapevine in the singular, and that's teaching that if there's going to be an embankment and you have a grapevine on the bottom part of the embankment, that you have to have a separation of at least 10 tefachim going up that embankment in order to plant something else. The Gemara now moves on to the next part of the Mishnah, which says that the following are prohibited with respect to the planting of foreign seed, but do not render the produce forbidden. And the term defines the term excess in each of these cases. In other words, the Gemara says the excess of the perimeter of the vineyard. This is going to refer to part of the perimeter that lies beyond the 4 amos adjacent to the vineyard. In other words, when we're looking at the space between the end of the vineyard and a fence or a wall, we're going to have a 12 amma gap. We covered this before. This was in chapter 4. So we're now talking about not the 4 amma work area that is right next to the vine that we know is Doraita. This is talking about the 8 amos that are going to be between the 4 amos setback and the wall. What's going to be over there? And so the Gemara says the excess of the perimeter of a vineyard is referring to the perimeter that lies beyond this 4 amos adjacent to the vineyard, it says this Gemara. And the excess of the destroyed area in the middle of a vineyard refers to the space that lies between the 4 amos adjacent to the vines on each side of the clearing. So again, what are we referring to? What happens if you planted in that 8 amos space between the end of the vineyard and the wall? Certainly, Doraita, if you plant within the 4 amma, that's going to be next to the vine. That's going to be forbidden Doraita. You have to rip up the seeds and you have to rip up the vines that are next to it. But what about in that 8 amos area that's going to be over there? What's going to happen? So that's going to be where you're not allowed to do it. But if you did it, do you have to rip everything up and burn it? No. Do you get makot? No. But you shouldn't do it, but the seed is not forbidden. So what about the next one? The excess of the disruption in the middle of the Aerys. We covered this before in the end of chapter 6, and this is referring to the area that lies between the 6 tefahim adjacent to the set of vines in each side of the disruption. And when the middle vine in an 11 vine Aerys is going to be removed, then this was where you're getting into the 8 tefach, 8 amos and a tefach wide. But because the Aerys is going to really be a vineyard d'Rabbanan, that if you have 5 vines left over, what happens if you are planting now, say, along the side, not between these 11 vines where one is knocked off in the middle, and now there's going to be 5 and 5 with this 8 tefach, 8 amos and a tefach gap. What we're talking about is on a normal vineyard, you can't plant within 4 amos anywhere. But on the Aerys, because it is going to be a vineyard d'Rabbanan, that on the side of it, those are going to be treated in a way like individual vines. You can't plant within 6 amos, 6 tefach on the sides of them, but between them it's going to be 8 amos and a tefach, and you're going to have issues with the wall, but we're not talking about the wall side. We're talking about the other side away from the wall. And then what about planting in the area that's going to lie between the 6 tefachim adjacent to these vines on each side of the disruption? And the idea is that it would seem that in actuality that it's going to be that this is like a vineyard but not quite a vineyard, and the Aerys is going to have a work area in some way that's going to be 4 amos, but that 4 amos is going to be measured from the wall. It's not measured from the vines themselves. And so you can have a case where on the side that's away from the wall, you can even be 6 tefach away. So what happens if you've now planted 6 tefach away from the trunks and the wall is going to be 4 amos away? Well, there's no problem there. It's like planting next to individual vines. And then the next part says that the excess of the lattice work of a trellised roof that's going to be supporting a grapevine, and that's going to render the area beyond the 6 tefahim surrounding the vine's trunk. So the case goes like this, that you have a grapevine that's trained on an overhead trellis. That's going to be subject to the 6 tefach work area for a single vine. And if you're planting within 6 tefach of the vine's trunk, that is going to render produce forbidden. But the Gemara is asserting that the excess of the trellis under which planting is going to be prohibited, but the produce is not rendered forbidden. What this is saying is that the portion of the trellis that's going to be 6 tefach surrounding the vine's trunk, that's going to be an issue. And the Chazan Ish explains about this in his Kilayim 13:6, that this rule is necessary only where the vine itself extends less than 6 tefachim along the trellis. In other words, it's being planted along a wall, and it's not where, like in the last case, that the wall is over here and the vines are over here and separation's 4 amos. What we're seeing here is that this is going to be where the lattice is right next to the trunk, and it goes right up it, and then there's an overhang, and you see that today, right? You see that where they'll have arched trellises, and the planting space will be right next to the trellis, and it'll climb up and go around. It'll be grapes overhead. I've seen that many times, and the idea is that, you have to make a 6 tefach separation from the trunk. Now, the Gemara gets onto the next part, and then we will be finishing up. And it says, what is the law regarding the space between the vines and the wall of the Aerys? And again, that's what we were just talking about. What do we do with the area within the Aerys? In other words, between the vines and the wall. And the Gemara is going to talk about this, that Rabbi Yochanan says it is prohibited to plant foreign seed there, and doing so renders the produce forbidden. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says it is indeed prohibited to introduce foreign seed there, but doing so does not render the produce forbidden. So Rabbi Yochanan, and this came up before in the end of chapter 6, that Rabbi Yochanan is basically saying that the area outside the Aerys between the 6 tefach work area is going to be classified as the excess. And the Rosh Hashanah says that it does not render the produce forbidden, and only the space between the vines and the wall, and also the space between the vines themselves, have the same stringency like within a vineyard. and that's going to render produce forbidden, and that's when it's planted there. But according to Rish Lakish, he's saying that everything beyond the 6 tefach surrounding each vine, including the space that's going to be between the wall and the vines, it's going to be in the category of the excess, and that's not going to render the produce forbidden. So in the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, it's not limited to the space between the vine and the wall, but is even going to be the work area surrounding the Aerys. And Rabbi Yochanan is going to hold that illegal planting anywhere within the prohibited 4 amos of an Aerys, even beyond the vine's 6 tefach work area, is going to result in the produce being rendered forbidden. And according to the understanding of Rabbi Yochanan's view, the excess of the disruption of the Aerys is going to be where the Mishnah states it does not render the produce forbidden, and that's going to refer to the small space, which is less than a tefach wide. That's going to be beyond the 4 amos between the Aerys and the other side of the gap. And that's going to be the definition. According to the Vilna Goan's reading of it, that the issue at hand does not relate to the planting in the Aerys, but the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, as the Vilna Goan reads it, is going to be that the status of spaces within a large vineyard, and he's going to basically be saying that you're going to have at least 3 rows, and the 3 rows were planted between 8 and 16 amos apart. So his reading about this actually ends up being very, very different. And again, it's going to be planting near an Aerys, not necessarily within the Aerys. And the Gemara is going to now talk about the next part, about the excess of a destroyed area in the middle of a grapevine, like what we covered in chapter 4, Halacha 1. And the Mishnah is going to say, if you wish to explain it, that if it's a large vineyard, in other words, one containing at least 3 rows that the Mishnah is talking about, why do I need the Mishnah to restrict the ruling to the destroyed area in the middle of the vineyard? And the idea, says the Gemara, is that the same law could have been taught even regarding the space between rows in the original planting of a vineyard. And if it is a small vineyard, that's going to be a 2-row vineyard that the Mishnah would be talking about. Why is there no vineyard perimeter for a small vineyard? In other words, when we learned about the vineyard perimeter, we learned it for a large vineyard. That's going to be 3 rows of 3. But we didn't learn this for a small vineyard, which is going to be 2 rows of 3. So what is the Mishnah talking about? Now, we learned this before in 4.1, that a vineyard is going to contain 2 rows that's not going to be subject to the vineyard perimeter stringency, only going to be where it's going to be the large vineyard. So, why is the Mishnah dealing specifically with the excess of destroyed area of the vineyard, and now we're talking about, planting within this 8 amos separation between this part and that part? And, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a 2-row vineyard? Are we talking about something like a large vineyard, which is going to be a 3-row vineyard? And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, what are we dealing with in our Mishnah? We're dealing with a large vineyard that someone planted in the planting arrangement of a small vineyard. In other words, the rows were planted at intervals of less than 8 amos, and in that way, the 2-row vineyard must be planted in order to qualify as a vineyard. So we're dealing with a large vineyard, and the law of the perimeter vineyard perimeter is going to be applicable. But since this vineyard is planted in a way where the rows are now less than 8 amos apart, the spaces between them do not have any portion in which the produce of a legal planting would be permitted for use. So the Mishnah had to teach this new ruling with regard to the case of a destroyed area in the middle of a vineyard, and where the gap can exceed 8 amos and have an excess in which the produce of a planting is not rendered forbidden. In other words, that, as we learned before, that the vineyard, if it's going to contain 2 rows, is not subject to the vineyard perimeter. And it's only going to be where, we're talking about the space between the vines and the wall is going to be 12 amos wide. And in this Mishnah, which is talking about both the excess of the vineyard clearing, again, between the space between the vines and the wall, and it's talking about where it has to at least be a large vineyard. It can't be a 2-row vineyard. That's going to be the idea. And based on this explanation, the Gemara is going to talk about a limitation of the law of the vineyard perimeter, and then we're going to finish up. Rabbi Zera says, this Mishnah tells us that a large vineyard that one planted at intervals of 8 amos or more does not have the vineyard perimeter. So why is this Mishnah talking about, the plants here? We're talking about a large vineyard where the planting is done where it's less than 8 amos apart. And Rabbi Zera is proceeding to look at another approach to this Mishnah. It's going to say that if you will suggest that the rows of the large vineyard are planted at intervals between even up to 16 amos, then the vineyard's interior, in other words, all the space between the rows is prohibited for planting and is also going to render the produce forbidden. And, that would account for why the Mishnah is referring to the destroyed area within a vineyard rather than the original spaces between the vineyard's rows. So this explanation is actually going to be premised on Rabbi Lazar's ruling that when the rows of a vineyard are planted between 8 amos and 16 amos apart, instead of 4 amos, like what we were talking about for planting in a normal vineyard, then the intervening spaces do not render forbidden the produce of foreign seed that's illegally planted there. In other words, that you can have, rows of vines connect even up to 16 amos away. And what happens if you have a 3-row vineyard and a guy, it looks like individual vines, but they're not, because they're even separated by 16 amos between row 1, row 2, and row 3. And these are not planted in a normal way where you plant it close together at 4 amos separations. It can be planted even up to 16 amos apart, and that's what we're talking about. So the Gemara says that, should it not certainly follow that the same stringency should also apply with a vineyard's exterior? In other words, that, like a destroyed area in the middle of a vineyard. So from the Mishnah, we see that it's ruling that the excess of a destroyed area in the middle of a vineyard does not render the produce forbidden. So what the Tana of this Mishnah is holding is that when the rows of the vines are spaced from 8 amos to 16 amos apart, not 4 amos like what it should be traditionally, the space between these areas of the 8 to 16 amos does not render produce that's forbidden if you've planted within this enlarged space. So if I have, 2 sets of vines over here, 3 and 3, and I have 16 amos to the third set, does that qualify as a large vineyard? Yes, it does. Now, do I have the vineyard perimeter like between the vines and the wall? Yes, I do. But what about the interior space between these 6 and these 3? If I planted, say, within a little gap there, say 12 amos or 11 amos apart between this set of vines and this set of vines, did I violate anything? Well, I'm not allowed to do it, but do I have to rip it up? I don't. And then the next clause is saying, what about the area beneath the grapevine? In other words, the work area of a single grapevine. And the Gemara concludes and says that Rabbi Yossi says that one does not incur lashes except for sowing the source of the vineyard. In other words, when do you get lashes for these violations? When you are doing this in purpose and you are planting it this way in purpose, that's when you have to uproot it, burn everything, and that's when you get lashes because you sowed it this way. Have a great day.